got an actually good mill card out of the spoilers from Aetherdrift, so of course I'm going to dedicate a whole video to it. So timestamps down below. We're going to talk about the power of this card, not only in Modern, but in Pioneer and in Standard as well. I think something like Riverchurn Monument does have the ability to put Pioneer Mill over the edge and potentially legitimize Mill as a win condition in Standard, but also actually be good in Modern Mill. Now we're going to break this whole card down in terms of combos and its synergies and how we want to think about something like this, and ultimately whether or not it's good. I definitely do think it is, but my job is to convince you of it. There's been a lot of naysayers about it. There's a lot of elements of it that can feel slow. People talking about the exhaust is too much. I'm going to break it all down. Let's hop right into it. First thing we got to do is break this card down. So blue in 1, Riverchurn Monument is an artifact that says pay 1 and tap any number of target players each mill 2 cards. So for the context of Commander, it's actually kind of nice if you're playing something like the Wise Mothman. This is going to be a great way to create individual like increments of triggers for yourself, but also pay 1 to mill 8 cards, 2, 2, 2, and 2 in a 4-player pot. But the exhaust ability is where it gets interesting. Blue in 2, tap any number of target players each mill cards equal to the number of cards in their graveyard. So very similar to the first ability, any number of target players. If you were to put this down in EDH, it's actually a fair amount of cards milled. So I really like this. So I really want to mention the fact that this does help mill in Commander. But when it comes to constructed, which is what the point of this video is, the exhaust ability can only happen once. So you pay 4 and tap this card. Any number of target players just mills equal to what's in their graveyard. So you can think of this like doubling up on your mill. It's like a better Fraying Sanity. Fraying Sanity comes down and does absolutely nothing. This does have passive value to it, and the exhaust ability is a soft once per game. So if you were to Echoing Truth this back to your hand or use an Otawara to bounce it, you would actually be able to play it and then use the exhaust ability after. What's also nice about this is that even if you use the exhaust ability, that's just that part. You are still able to, after the fact, use the top part tap ability to continue to mill each player. And in a deck that plays Visions of Beyond, milling target players, like any number of target players, is also relevant because sometimes you will need to mill yourself to enable something like a Visions of Beyond. Heck, if you're playing something like Mission Briefing and want to get real spicy, or just again enabling a Jace the Perfected Mind on top of Visions of Beyond, then using something like this to mill yourself is actually really valuable if you find that that's where you're at. But so Riverchurn Monument also being blue is relevant in a world where we have pitch cards, and so in a world where this does not get consigned to memory, I figure it's kind of relevant in that way, shape, or form. So let's break this down. First and foremost, its synergies in Pioneer, then in Standard, and the bulk of the video we're going to kind of spend in Modern, closer to the half of it. So if you want to skip ahead, timestamps down below. Let's hop into Pioneer Mill. Now, when it comes to this is a list that Ziriak actually recently posted, and this is a player that's very much 5-0'd and done well with Modern Mill, so they do have a lot of experience with the archetype, and so having great options in here straight off the bat. You have the Drown in the Locks, the Crypt Incursion. Drown's actually going to be really important. Founding in the Third Path is kind of nice too. It's not going to be able to recast something like this artifact, but it is going to be a way for you to recur some of your other spells. You have Breaking and Entering in the front side, Maddening Cacophony, Tome Scour as like a soft Hedron Crab because we only have Ruin Crab, and Jace the Perfected Mind in here as well as for the top end. Now we do have some ability to have like soft fetches in the format. We have the Field of Ruins, no Archive Traps. Obscura Storefront acts as like a soft fetch, and Fable of Passage is a fetch land in and of itself, but really the only one that you really have access to in the format, and so that's how you enable your crabs. You have some anti-aggro payoffs here, but I think the big thing this deck misses is just having that surgical effect. Although if Surgical Extraction was legal in the Pioneer format, I think like that would fundamentally shift the name of the game here, because combo would just then have that big piece against it. In the sideboard, we have a classic Profane Memento, which I'm a big fan of. Tasha's Hideous Laughter is legal in this format, although it's very matchup specific. The general converted mana cost of Pioneer decks tends to be like on average higher in my experience. Ashiok Dreamrender has some graveyard hate and Extinction Event as a board wipe. So when it comes to something like this, you have the Maddening Cacophony Fraying Sanity combo. So if you were to kicker this, then you could have Fraying Sanity kind of double up and mill someone in one shot. On average, you're probably playing 23 to 24 lands in Pioneer without fetches. You don't have have access to perfect mana and just a lower curve of cards, you are on average playing a higher curve. And so with something like this, there tends to be like some things missing. Like you have some of the mid-range pieces and the control elements, you have the removal, you have the counter spell, although you don't have hard counter spell, you have dig through time. Not only are you filling your own yard with some amount of things, I think having access to dig through time is really powerful in the sense that you are going to be able to tutor up parts of your combo, especially post sideboard, being able to dig and filter for things like Ashiok and your kind of extinction events. Like the monument is going to be able to help filter for that. And then ultimately where this card like really shines is the fact that sometimes all you're doing is missing like that extra oomph of your mill. You have cast a Tome Scourer 2, you've cast a Maddening Cacophony. They have somewhere in between like 15 to 25 cards left in like in their graveyard. By that point, they probably drawn somewhere between 3 to 5 cards. And so that means that they have like 30 cards legitimately left in their deck. And so something like that exhaustibility can tap for 4 and then just almost completely mill them out and shut them out of the game, or enable a Crypt Incursion really well. And so something like this I think can really slot in well, potentially in the slot of Founding of the Third Path, a card that does mill, but in you know, a lot of cases allows you to, you know, play Founding of the Third Path, set it up, but then also then be able to cast Breaking and Entry. Maddening Cacophony in the post board is also going to allow you to cast like Tasha's Hideous Laughter out of the graveyard. The front side of it doesn't let you cast that, but that third chapter will let you kind of recast that out of the graveyard. And then also like you are going to be able to recast like other things like Dig Through Time, reuse your Crypt Incursion, all that stuff. So being able to like mill yourself to be able to enable something like a Founding of the Third Path is great, really great. So potentially even just replacing the whole Maddening Cacophony freeing sanity side of things is really powerful. I think the rest of the elements of this deck are actually like pretty stock in my opinion. I think Dig Through Time is replaceable, but like in this combo oriented version, I think you would probably want to play it. And so I think like something like this adds that extra element of like, this is the finisher, you play it out and you have access to it as a control element, as something that you can do with open mana. If you're holding up a Drown, you're holding up a Fatal Push, you're holding up at like something at instant speed. If they don't end up baiting into it, you don't end up having a target for something like that, then you can still pay the 1, tap the monument, mill your opponent for 2, heck, even mill yourself for 2 if you want to, and maybe enable something like a Founding of the Third Path on one of its final chapters. And so like all of these elements coming together add a lot to a deck like this. It's not necessarily like a really powerful deck. There are elements to Modern Mill that really push it above in the modern metagame that Pioneer Mill doesn't have access to. Again, like just the fact that you don't have archive traps in a format that doesn't have fetches, you don't have surgical extraction either to be able to stop the combo decks, which is kind of the name of the game in Modern Mill. I think that adding a card like this does again help it go over the top. You don't want to be playing like Attack Mill with like Cruel Summerphage or like the Gargoyle or anything like that. That's just not what you want to do. You want to play the control game. You want to kind of mill them out slowly. Chances are though there are elements of the Pioneer metagame that tend to be a little too fast, so it can be hard to contend with sometimes. So that's where I think Pioneer Mill is at with something like this. Am I really going to be playing this format? Probably not. I'm going to call it fetchland elitism. I just don't find the gameplay of this format to be like as interesting. I'm very like shied away from it, and I think I've spent a lot of resources trying to learn Legacy, and I'm really enjoying it, so I might just stick to that. Now, when it comes to the standard metagame, I actually am really interested in this from the perspective of like, I did download Arena, a lot of people talking about how standard's in a really good place right now. So I'm really interested in just like good Magic gameplay, especially with Pioneer entering there. That's like a very ease of access way to just like get my quick hit of Pioneer and leave. You also have Timeless, which is really an unmanaged format because Wizards of the Coast isn't really doing bans for it. It's a Wild West, but at the end of the day, it's a fetchland format. Something like standard, I think, is really interesting because now you actually have mill as a legitimate win condition. Now, Jace the Perfected Mind is standard legal. I've actually been recently told that it will probably be rotating out in October, which kind of makes me sad. I think once that happens, I think the mill win condition goes, but Jace the Perfected Mind actually ends up being like a legitimate like control win condition. There are like deck lists that will play it as a win condition. If you look at something like this Azorius control list, it is primarily playing Jace the Perfected Mind as a win condition here, as that ability to tick up over time, get your opponent for a large amount mill, draw some cards, like get what you need in terms of counter spells and removal. I think something like this is actually like really cool. So on top of that, I think the tome actually really the monument actually really does help, because when you look at like Dimir control being at the top, this is a tempo based strategy using Kaido and a bunch of creatures, but the control elements and the cards are there to the point where you could play the tome as a soft like mill card to be able to just mill your opponent over time, have Jace as like a board control element because +1 does kind of control elements of the board, and then use that to then ultimately like slowly mill your opponent over the game. That's the power of something like the Monument. You can just like tick it over and over and over again. If you have your own soft graveyard synergies, I mean, they're talking to the fact that, I mean, Bloodghast is kind of in this set as well. So there are going to be some soft graveyard synergies that you're going to be able to take advantage of. And so you're going to see that in the limited environment and somewhat in the standard environment. We don't have all the spoilers out yet, but something like that is really powerful to mill yourself with graveyard synergies, but also mill your opponent as a win condition over time to then enable the Jace's draw 3, but then also enable in the future Jace as a win condition in a control deck. So I'll definitely be looking to like kind of brew that for mill in that format. So let me know if you want to see that. I'll probably be posting gameplay of that on the second channel if I do. This channel is primarily kind of EDH, Legacy, Modern, Pauper. It's kind of like the more popular formats in that sense, so I don't want to bog down my analytics with arena content that frankly the YouTube algorithm doesn't want me to post on this channel, but that is standard. I think this deck definitely has a place there. But when it comes to Modern Dimir Mill, folks, I think we might be cooking with this one. I'm not gonna lie, I think we might be cooking with this one. So this is a standard mill list, right? So this is one that, you know, Ultimate Guard opened 6-2 in Prague. Shout out to them for getting 6-2 in the RCQ here. Or Ziriak, we just talked about how they made a Modern Pioneer list, 13th in the Modern Challenge. Tibalt classically 5-0ing. We have other Dimir Mill players in the Prague list as well. A lot of people just doing well with the archetype. The archetype is good. But when it comes to something like the Monument, I think like thinking about this card alongside Drown in the Loch is really powerful. I'm not saying that these are the same card and they're comparable. I'm thinking about the axis to which you play both. So Drown in the Loch is a card that you're always going to hold up. It's a counter spell. It's a removal spell. It's a really flexible card and one that's really a staple in the mill list. If you're letting go of this card, it's for budget reasons or you're trying to do something silly, which is fine. You're just not doing anything competitive. That's the key when it comes to Drown in the Loch. It's that powerful. We even see it in other Modern lists as well, but primarily in the Modern mill list, that's where you're going to see this counter target spell with mana value less than or equal to the number of cards in controller's graveyard. Destroy target creature with mana value less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller graveyard. What's powerful about this is if you have the Monument out, you can just at end of turn, if your opponent doesn't play something that you want to drown, counter, or destroy, then you can just tap this and then mill them for 2 cards and mill yourself for 2 cards if you want. And so that having that passive value over time is really powerful. And also when it comes to Drown in the Loch, if your opponent like endurances or they Tormod's Crypt, maybe through like a something like a Urza Saga, if they use those effects to like try and make it so Riverchurn, like something like your Drown in the Loch isn't that great, lower CMC spells like counter spells literally to Ragavans or just Orcish Bowmasters, like if they zero out their graveyard, you can still Riverchurn Monument, mill them out, and then still have Drown in the Loch work. So not only are you still passively milling them, but you're then able to use that spare mana on enabling your Drown further against some hate, but also using it instead of the Drown in the Loch in terms of passive value. So it's always nice to be able to maximize your mana in archetypes like this. Obviously, when this comes down, it doesn't do anything, so that's going to be its biggest problem. But hey, you are able to use it passively once you get it down. The next piece is alongside like big instances of mill. So once you get like a couple of Hedron Crab triggers, Ruin Crab triggers, you get like an Archive Trap, maybe 2, your opponent's like drawn a couple of cards, you're probably at like 30 cards in their graveyard, 25 to 30 cards in the graveyard, very similar to what I was talking about in Modern. And so once you have this out on 4, Riverchurn Monument almost is like an uncounterable way to finish them off. Because what's nice about the exhaustibility is like on turn 4, like it's actually not that hard to get to 4 mana. 5 mana is where it gets really tricky. 4 mana can be tough. Usually you're at 3 and you try and make that work. 4 is like a good spot. 5 is really tough, but sometimes you need to. It's happened. If you need a hard cast and Archive Trap, it's happened. I've won that way. But once you get to 4, it's almost like, again, an uncounterable way to mill out the rest of your opponent's deck, because this card is already going to be out on the field. You're going to be able to use the exhaustibility. If they don't win, fair enough, you can still exhaust at the end of their turn. and then untap and mill and continue to win out that way. Because that's also what's nice about the exhaust ability, which is what I mentioned already. You were able to use the exhaust ability, and then yeah, you can bounce it, return it, play it again, use the exhaust ability down the line. If you have a ton of mana, sure, do what you need to do. But you can use the exhaust ability and still untap and use the top side of the card. There's also no timing restriction on it. You don't need to use this at sorcery speed. You don't need to use either side of it at sorcery speed. So having the access to both abilities at instant speed is really powerful. And that's the big thing that's holding it really high up for me. Not only are you going to be able to kind of mill them out to just enable something like a Shelldock Isle, just take them over the edge, even if you're not winning with it, just be able to double them up. Like, in a 60 card deck, they draw 7 cards that are 53 cards. If you mill 20 cards, they then have, they have 33 cards left in the deck. By that time, I don't know, you mill 20 cards, they've probably drawn a card or two, maybe fetched, like they're at, something like 30, they're at like 30 cards. Okay, activate Riverchurn Monument, mill them out, untap your Shelldock Isle is like enabled at that point. They're not milled out, but probably you put like a Archive Trap, you put like a Fractured Sanity underneath your Shelldock Isle, and chances are, based on how your mana spread, you can tap the Shelldock Isle, tap another blue, and still have mana for like a Drown or some other spell, some other way to interact in that case. So I really like how Riverchurn Monument slots in to further enable some instant speed shenanigans and smooth out your mana. And I'm not saying that this card is going to be like a 4 of. I think this card is actually a really valuable flex slot of like 1 to 2. It's kind of like Jace. Like Jace the Perfected Mind comes in and out of mill decks, and really the only reason it's there is, yeah, it's like a bad Fractured Sandy. It's 4 mana, mill 15, but also it's like a 1 to 2 of more copies, sometimes just like it replaces the visions entirely, to be that visions, to come down on 3 or on 4 and still be able to -2, mill 3 cards, draw 3 cards, and then like throw an attack into it, because your opponent almost needs to attack into it if they're not able to win on that turn. Because then if you play Jace on 4, you didn't lose any life, so you're not lower, but then you -2, Jace is still at 3. And if you draw 3 cards, Jace is at 3, you can -2 again. So it almost like evades an attack as well. So Jace is really powerful in that sense. So if you have those type of flex slots, I think Riverchurn Monument can enter really well in those type of decks as well. Again, as a 1 to 2 of, I will definitely be making gameplay videos where like this is a 4 of in the deck. I will be min-maxing and trying my best to showcase this card. But also, the one thing I want to give a shout out to like Party Time Austin here, a friend of the channel, and you like active user on the Mill Discord and all that stuff, but they're talking about potentially going in like a control route. So similar to standard mill, as I was talking about, what's nice about Riverchurn Monument, as I mentioned, it doesn't get hit by consignment memory because it's blue. So not only does it kind of get around like some traditional artifact hate that exists in this format, but it also pitches to Force of Negation and pitches to Subtlety. So if you went for a control route of mill, playing Jace the Perfected Mind, counterspell removal, like some type of Dimir control list, this does pitch to Force of Negation and Subtlety, so it gives you that extra control. So if you don't need it to activate and exhaust whatever, you can still use it to pitch those cards and save your maybe more powerful mill cards in the moment. So a lot of positives with Riverchurn Monument. I think like this does have the legs to be a 1 to 2 of in modern mill. It's not a playset. It's not like the second coming. It's not the third coming of Hedron Crab. It's not a new Archive Trap. It's nothing that crazy. It's not Tasha's Hideous Laughter. It's not Fractured Sanity, but it is something that's worth trying and has a really interesting ability due to the lack of timing restrictions and the fact that you can continue to use it. I think it's really powerful just being that finisher, just being able to go over the top. How many times have you played a game of modern mill and you just thought to yourself, like, if I just had like the ability, like I've milled 30 cards, I need some way to double this up. Like, oh, I don't have Fraying Sanity. I would have had to have had that out the whole game while I was playing on mill spells. But what if I just like top decked a way to like overpower them, just like overthrow them? I played this and then next turn just say pretty much I'm going to untap and I'm going to mill you out. Like, this is a card that finishes. It legitimately can mill like 20, 30 cards if your opponent already has that amount of cards in their graveyard. So a really powerful card in general. I think it has the slots for it. Maybe I'm talking out of my butt here. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Do you think Riverchurn Monument has what it takes to not only put Pioneer Mill over the edge and be a legitimate win condition in standard, but do you think this has a spot in modern mill? Am I just, again, speaking out of my butt? Do I not know what I'm talking about? Is pitching to Subtlety just you know, too much hope here? And is modern mill just fine without this card? I don't know. I always like the fact that like when you get options like this, it's always nice to explore. It's always nice to try things like this out. think some of the positives like are really good for something like this. And it's honestly, it's a type that like a lot of people aren't used to interacting with in mill. They're used to interacting with instants and sorceries, killing your crabs, and like the only artifact people are usually used to dealing with is something like an ensnaring bridge. I don't think they'll be ready for Riverchurn Monument, especially early on. And I don't even know if it's worth being ready for Riverchurn Monument, because of course it still loses to the traditional hate that a lot of mill decks lose to. Like if you activate Riverchurn Monument and you exhaust it and your opponent endurances, yeah, you're not going to mill anything. Not only are you going to shuffle those cards back, but you're not going to mill anything because you then can't mill your opponent because they have no cards left in their graveyard. So I think the traditional hate cards against this card are already going to hate it out. So it's not doing anything new there, right? But it's doing something cool. It's doing something at instant speed, and I think it helps like smooth out mana in some cases. Maybe it's like a win more card. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I'm blabbing at this point, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on Riverchurn Monument.